Welcome to a Listen to Learn episode of the Share Life podcast. I'm Jason Scott Montoya, and today I'm here with Steve Thomason. Steve, say hello.
Hello, everybody.
I'm glad to have you here. Steve and I are going to talk about a recent blog post that he did about the Gospel of Luke in the Shadow of Tyranny. Now, Steve is an associate pastor of spiritual formation and discipleship at Luther Seminary. He's now the dean of the chapel and a campus pastor, correct?
Yeah, and you said I'm an associate professor of spiritual formation and dean of the chapel.
Okay, cool. You're also a post-evangelical person, missional-oriented, neo-Lutheran theologian, rostered in the LCA. Tell us what the LCA is for those that don't know.
ELCA is the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America.
Okay. And you are also the artist pastor. You write and draw about spiritual formation, biblical studies, theology, and art, which is how we intersected. Anything else you want to add to that before I talk about how we got connected?
No, that's plenty.
Cool. So years ago, Steve did a video about constructive developmental theory based on the book In Over Our Heads by Robert Keegan, and he did a visual illustration of the main framework of the concept in the book, and in a visual way. So when I talk to people about constructive developmental theory, I'll send them that video or something like it, because it's such a fascinating idea that's super helpful, but it's also somewhat complex, and your video just does a really great job of simplifying it for those that aren't in that world. But it has to do with just how adults develop psychologically as they get older and go through their life. So that was the first intersection. I think I subscribed to your channel at that point. And I ended up, through that, ended up following your blog and subscribed to it, the RSS feed in my Feedly. And I ended up, you did another video a bit later, which really talks about how the cross intersects and intervenes as a way to prevent the spiral, the religious and political retaliation spiral that essentially the Bible talks about and that we all participate in. And so we all sort of unravel and lose our minds and lose our ways and hurt each other as humans. And so you did this really interesting video about how the cross intersects with that idea. And then most recently, the thing that stuck out that had me reach out to Steve and say, hey, jump on the podcast with me, is he did a blog post about the Gospel of Luke in the Shadow of Tyranny. And today I really want to dive into that specifically and just, talk with Steve about this. So Steve, tell us, what was the origin of this post about, pulling in the Gospel of Luke and how it relates to the Shadow of Tyranny, and what does that even mean? And get us started with how that came about. Yeah.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah.
I was so pleasantly surprised, So this post came about because of a couple different things. My work as the art pastor is one of the things that I do is I create visual resources for the lectionaries. So they're so anybody who's part of a mainline church, there's a thing called the Revised Common Lectionary.
Okay.
Which, and if you don't know what a lectionary is, that is just it's a reading list that is published, and it's used by hundreds of thousands of congregations around the world. And it gives a standardized way of working through scripture for worship. And so there's always 4 readings. There's like a Hebrew scripture reading, and then there's always a psalm. Then there's always a Christian scripture reading, like from the letters. And then there's always a gospel. Yeah. And the Revised Common Lectionary is in a 3-year cycle. So it has a year A, which focuses on Matthew. Year B is Mark. Year C is Luke. But I also follow another lectionary called the Narrative Lectionary. And that was developed, I won't go through all the details of why, but it follows a different arc and has a different purpose. And the purpose of the narrative is to help congregations work through scripture from Genesis all the way to the early church every year in chronological order. So it
Yeah.
spends the fall working through the Hebrew story, and then each year it focuses in on one of the Gospels to walk through the life of Jesus from Christmas to Easter, chronologically through one Gospel.
Yeah.
And every single week, I send out a resource for preachers and teachers who follow both of these lectionaries. And I'm a total geek when it comes to this stuff. And so since the RCL is on a 3-year cycle and the narrative is on a 4-year cycle, it's a rare occasion. It's kind of like an alignment of the planets when they are in the same gospel. And so
Yeah.
for the last 3 years, they've been in sync. So there's been a
Wow.
Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So this year is the last year that they're synced up. So all of that to say, that's why I care about Luke this year, is because I've been soaking in Luke all year because it is the year of Luke in both lectionaries. And as dean of the chapel, I'm also planning worship based upon the Revised Common Lectionary.
Yeah.
And so thinking about Luke, it's on my mind. I illustrated the Gospels as graphic novels. And so like I've got all these visual resources. So I'm looking at my blog post right now, and it was dated January 24th.
Yeah.
And so as essentially the campus pastor for Luther Seminary, you know, any pastor, our job is to keep the pulse of 3 things. One is to be students and teachers of Scripture. Like, what is Scripture saying? And if you follow a lectionary, then it's like prescribed to you which text you have to wrestle with each week. And know your congregation. Like, what are the longings and losses of your congregation? Like, where are they? What are they wrestling with in each moment, each week to week? And then keep in tune to what's going on in the larger world, right?
Yeah.
Well, January 24th was, I had the great privilege of preaching the day after inauguration. No, I'm sorry. The privilege of preaching the day after Election Day
Okay.
back in
So
the
in November.
fall, in November. So Election Day was on a Tuesday. We have chapel on Wednesday. So I preach Wednesday mornings, not Sunday mornings. And
Yeah.
so Luther Seminary is the largest seminary of the ELCA, which is the on the continuum of theology. We would be more on the liberal side of the theological equation. And so in our ecosystem of staff and faculty and students, we are not exclusively this, but we have probably a majority of more like blue leaning people in our ecosphere. So they were
Yeah.
not super chipper on that
Yeah.
Wednesday morning, given
Yeah.
the turn of the election, right? And so then January 20th, of course, was Inauguration Day, and the executive orders that started flooding out of the White House on Inauguration Day and since then, just, of course, I don't think we can underestimate the impact that has had across the world.
Yeah.
And so in light of all of that, I just felt like I needed to reflect on that moment in
Yeah.
some kind of pastoral way. And I try really hard, one of the big controversies for pastors is, is the pulpit political? Should a pastor be political and all that? And of course, political simply means having to do with people. And
Yeah.
so like everything's political.
Yeah.
But I really don't think, this is my personal perspective, and I know that people disagree all across the board on this, but I don't think a pastor should get up in a pulpit and endorse a candidate. I just don't think that's the role of the pastor.
Okay.
However, the pastor is also supposed to preach the gospel, the good
Yeah.
news. And
Yeah.
in my understanding of the good news is that the good news is that God loves everybody.
Mm-hmm.
and that everyone is welcome at the table.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so some of the things that have been happening in our current administration, in my perspective, really are anti-gospel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so that's, but I actually, my original title for this was, the Gospel of Luke in the shadow of Trump.
Yeah.
And I felt like, no, I actually don't want to go there, because I don't want to name names in this moment. And so I think it's actually more, well, I don't know. My take on it is I wanted to just be about what was happening in Jesus' day,
Yeah.
and then let people draw their own conclusions as to how it
Yeah.
applies to
Connect the
this
dots.
moment.
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, because like I don't want to get pulled into the name calling and mudslinging. That's just not helpful either. I just want to call a thing what it is, and talk about what does loving my neighbor actually look like, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. That's the context, and so I just felt like I needed to write this blog post as some way
Yeah.
of having a pastoral response to what was happening in that moment, that week.
Yeah. How much of that would you say is, I think most of what you're describing is very much you're trying to meet people where they are based on who is under your reign of influence and authority. But how much of this type of thing is also like for you to help sort it out for yourself?
Oh yeah, it's mostly for that.
Mostly.
Yeah, it's mostly for me just trying to make sense out of it. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a really good question, because it's not one or the other. It's an even mix.
Yeah.
As a leader in a as a spiritual leader in a seminary context, and as a pastor. I've been a pastor for 30 years, and I come from an evangelical background and a very conservative background. And so I have a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people in my sphere of influence and my social media network and stuff who are huge Trump supporters, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and so I live in that weird tension. And
Yeah.
I'm not a Democrat. Like I'm if I were anything, I'd probably be independent, and I
Yeah.
vote for the issues, that kind of thing. So I meet with a spiritual director regularly, and one of the things that we have talked about in my particular call is I feel called to the gaps.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a gap dweller, right? Where
Yeah.
I find myself in so many different parts of my life, standing between factions,
Yeah.
and really finding, like, I relate to both sides of whatever the topic is,
Yeah.
but I also disagree with both sides on other issues,
Mm-hmm.
and I find myself trying to find ways to find that commonality, to find that construct. That's why I created that second video that you talked about. That's really drawing on, philosophically, it's drawing on
Yeah.
constructive,
So you want to tell us a little bit about that? It's, people understand the framework there, and they can
sure, sure, yeah,
go watch the full thing for the full details. But yeah.
yeah. So actually, the very first video that you mentioned, the Keegan video, I'll just give a little background. So my PhD work was my theoretical framework was around like constructivist epistemology and communicative rationality, that critical
Okay.
social theory and Habermas and that kind of stuff, which that's all nerdy philosophical stuff. But in plain language, it means that we construct our understanding of reality in community and in conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't believe there is an absolute objective thing that is completely right that exists out there that we go try to find. But I think that we are in relationship with God and the world and each other, and through the relationality and the communication, we co-create the thing that is the best thing for our society.
Yeah.
And that's what communicative rationality is. And so that was what was behind, well, the Keegan video. I just made that because he's a psychologist and I needed to understand his 5 orders of consciousness.
Yeah.
But that was one of the frameworks for my dissertation, which is why I made that video. I
Okay.
made that 100% for me to try to understand Keegan.
Yeah.
And then I just decided to share it. And I found
Yeah.
out that a lot of other people found it helpful too, which is really cool. But then this other video that you're mentioning, I actually created that animation for a sermon in 2016. And it was
Mm.
actually leading up to, it was in October of 2016 when we were, actually it was in August because we were preaching a series on the Old Testament book of Job, which
Okay.
was talking about, suffering and
Hmm.
like good and evil and where is God and all the complexity of suffering. And also knowing that we were coming towards this heated, that was the Trump Clinton election. And so the congregation that I was serving was very divided between red and
Hmm.
blue, and also divided theologically because there were some really heated, particular theological topics that the church was really divided around.
Hmm.
And so I created this video as a way to help my congregation understand that there is a third way. Because I actually don't like the term purple when people talk about that we're purple,
Yeah.
because and the whole gist of that video was that when you have two opposing ideologies, both of those ideologies exist for a good reason. Like
Hmm.
people don't just randomly say, hey, I want to be a jerk today, I'm going to wake up and do something that makes everybody else suffer. I really don't think that's the motivation for most people. There might be some
Yeah.
people that's
Yeah.
but like ideological structures exist because everybody wants to survive. Everybody wants, I mean, the natural human instinct is self-protection, right? So like tribal
Hmm.
instinct is a natural part of being human.
Yeah.
And so we naturally construct things that protect our own,
Yeah.
and rightly so, right? Especially in an ancient world where like there's animals out there that are going to eat your babies and you
Yeah.
don't want them to, right? So
Yeah.
you create tribal protections. And then there's one author that recently talked about how, you know, the tribalism that protected us for most of human history is now the thing that's going to kill us, because our population has gotten to a point, and pluralization and globalization has gotten to a point where now we've got to get past tribalism and understand that we're one people on one planet. But that's a huge shift when you
Hmm.
talk about millennia of history of tribalism. So anyway, you get like two opposing ideologies, and they're both valid,
Hmm.
and they're both built upon solid logical reasoning. And the video that I made was within a Christian theology. I mean, we're talking like Christians on Christians, not even like a whole global perspective.
Yeah.
That two sides of every topic, are doing good theology, and that becomes the problem. So how? So the idea of compromise being red and blue becoming purple actually doesn't solve anything, because suddenly you're no longer red or blue.
Hmm.
You're a new thing that isn't anything that anybody wanted to start with. And so I think ultimately it's not a helpful image.
Yeah.
And so this idea of, I build that whole video on one of the main reasons I became a Lutheran theologian is the idea of paradox, and the reality of the complexity and the mystery of reality is
Hmm.
deeper than our puny little rationalist minds can conceive of. Like every big question seems to always come to equal and opposite possibilities, both being true. And
Yeah.
so that in itself leads me to wonder, there's probably some deeper reality that we just can't even conceive of.
Mm-hmm.
So paradox or dialectical tension is where reality exists, I think. And so what I'm trying to say in that video is, if we can learn how to have enough humility to open the gates of our fortress to say, I could be wrong, at least a little,
Mm-hmm.
enough to listen to the other side, and the back and forth listening to have enough wisdom and enough compassion for the other side to begin having a dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
It's that dialectic, that communicative, rationality, that in the video I talk about how that in itself creates like this force field that creates a bridge between the two.
Yeah.
That is neither solid nor liquid, that is neither color nor non-color. And it's
Mm-hmm.
in that space that we can actually have a mutual flourishing. So I say all of that in pictures in a short video.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know
And
if
what
that's
kind of?
helpful, but
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's great. There's so many layers to peel out there. But what kind of reaction did you get to the video? Did you get any kind of response in terms of it helping to accomplish what you're describing? I mean, I really like the idea of the sort of sitting with the tension instead of trying to resolve the tension. That the tension is actually it's to maintain, not to be to resolve, and to sit in that tension. And that tension, I think, what Robert Keegan would say is that tension actually is an opportunity for us to change. It allows us to change, and we want to get rid of it because maybe we don't want to change.
right. That, like his third book, Immunity to Change, is
Yeah,
is that resistance or the belief that we can't change.
yeah,
Uh, but Keegan would say you can teach an old dog new tricks.
yeah. It's just you got to
So
unpack all the layers. Yeah.
yeah. So your question was, how did people respond to that video?
Yeah, did you get any kind of response and to the video itself?
Yeah, so different layers of response. I told you I created that video for a particular sermon,
Mm-hmm.
for a particular group of people. And so I showed the video during my sermon as like the predominant bulk of the sermon, and then just talked about it. And the people in the congregation really loved it.
Mm,
It felt, because what it does is it honors both sides,
yeah.
and it, because what tends to happen is a preacher will take their own side of of a a debate like this, and kind of use the pulpit as a bully pulpit. And some people, I try not to create an environment where there's winners and losers when you have these kinds of debates.
Mm,
And I feel like the purpose of my video was to honor the fact that people are coming from a valid perspective and calling for a third way. And the third way, of course, I have to express my bias, right? So I'm a disciple of Jesus,
mm-hmm.
and I believe that the way of Jesus is the way of the cross, not
Mm-hmm.
the way of domination. Jesus didn't come to win; he actually came to lose,
Yeah.
to show us that it is the way of love and forgiveness that is the only path to life. And when we turn the gospel into a win-lose, zero-sum, or a dominance game, that's not the gospel that Jesus presented. And so, in my perspective,
Yeah.
and
Well, I
and
guess when.
and
Well, do you want me to interject, or you want to finish your thought?
no, go. I was just
Okay.
going to say, people responded well to it, and then online, predominantly got good response. Like you're an example of that. You were a person who randomly watched it on YouTube and found it to be helpful. So
Yeah. So the domination thing is interesting because I agree with you, and I think Christians are being enticed into a domination paradigm. And
yes.
I think part of the reason is, and I think there's a couple layers here, when you have those two ideological, strongly grounded poles and they go at it, and then it creates the tension, that tension surfaces something in both of them and in all of us. And that temptation to dominate becomes maximized. That is when domination is the most tempting, I think.
Yeah.
And it's hard to say no to that temptation. That's like the ring in the Lord of the Rings. Like, wow, this
Yeah.
ring is really powerful. Maybe I ought to
Yeah.
put it on. And so I think it almost reveals that domination piece in us that is there in all of us that maybe we don't appreciate enough, nor do we know is there. What would you say to that? Do you agree?
Yeah. Well, I agree. And I think so in my world of studying spirituality and spiritual formation, I think I'm a big fan of tools like the Enneagram and things, or just being aware of the fact that people are wired differently. And so I think people respond to their stimulus differently based on who they are.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think some people, people talk about A type, B type, or the alpha male or whatever. So some people, I think, respond aggressively to things. I think some people respond, passively, or, some people run into a battle, some people retreat from a battle, all that kind of stuff. But I think what actually activates all of this is fear. Because, let's go back to that tribal instinct. If your number one goal is the survival of your tribe, not even your survival of yourself, right? So let's remove the radical individualism that dominates our current moment, right? But just think about, like, most of human history, people's identity was wrapped up in their tribe. And so that's why a warrior would be willing to go out and die in battle, because what matters for them most is that their tribe survives. And so if you become convinced that there is another tribe out there that they desire to eradicate your tribe, then first of all, you're afraid, because nobody wants to die. Nobody wants to be eradicated. Mm-hmm. And so that fear, then you're forced with a choice. And so we all do our reptilian regression into the spinal, into the brain stem, and be like, fight, flight, freeze, or there's a fourth F that I always forget. But it's a natural response. So you look at a threat and you say, I can take this guy. And so then you fight,
Yeah.
But if you look at the threat and you go, I'm not strong enough to defend myself, then you start going into, well, maybe if I stay frozen, they won't notice me. Or maybe if I run, I might be faster than them.
Yeah.
Or maybe I could, like, fawn. That's what it is, fawn. Like, maybe I could convince them to like me. So I'd rather survive as a slave than be eliminated as an enemy, that kind of thing.
Interesting.
And so, so you have all of these different natural responses to a threat. And so, like, to your initial question, with Christians who are tempted into domination, when you have rival ideologies, if you feel, for whatever reason, if that ideology threatens your sense of identity or your sense of correctness, or I think for Christians, what's happening is there is a different understanding of the gospel out there that is threatening your construct of who God is and of what the call of the gospel actually is. And suddenly that other version of the gospel becomes a false gospel, which is then a threat to Christianity or to the gospel itself. And so that fear kicks in, and then that sense of self-justified, I'm defending God and I'm defending all that is good and right. and which has led to all the violence, of the church over the centuries. The
Yeah.
Crusades, and all of the horrible things done in the name of Jesus. So I don't know if I answered your question, but
Yeah, there's I guess I almost want to add one more layer too. So the fear, like you're describing, it creates a dynamic that then creates these postures and positions that I think what happens is then they hurt each other because people
oh
hurt
yeah,
each other in different ways. And
yep,
I think the fear transitions to contempt and hatred.
mm-hmm.
And I think this is the difference between World War One and World War Two. World War One, I think, is what you're describing, that sort of fear dynamic. And if people had shown more empathy and understanding, like they maybe have been able to sort of navigate that more wisely. But then they hurt each other really badly. And now there's hatred and contempt. And that contempt is brewing for years, and it manifests in all kinds of ways. And World War II is really a domination based on hatred. And that's sort of the next layer of the cycle of retaliation that goes to like a place that really is almost impossible to undo or to stop. It takes a miracle in a way.
Yeah, oh absolutely. Because you have to dehumanize your enemy in order to eradicate them, right? You
Mm-hmm.
have to somehow rationalize in your own mind that the person you're against is either outside of the sphere of God's love and concern, or is not actually human, or worthy of existing, and
Yeah,
therefore you feel justified to eliminate them.
yeah, and that's actually I enjoy watching the show The Walking Dead. Have you ever seen it?
I know of it, but I never watched it.
Okay,
I'm not really
so
a big zombie fan.
okay, but that it's really the zombies are the backdrop, but it's really what we're talking about that the show is about. It's these dynamics, and it's really what the people do to each other. That's the horror. And what you see is kind of because society is unraveled because of this apocalypse, then they end up, these different tribes create, and they end up doing horrible things to each other, and that creates the spiral. And then there are some characters that are trying to resist falling into that and choosing another path. And I think that's, when I think about that hatred spiral, think about all the terrible things that could be done to me and my family and my community and my friends, like worst case scenario. It would just be impossible for me to not want revenge and to retaliate against the people that did that. And like it would take a miracle. And I think that's really where Jesus comes into the scene. Is that's the story of the Passion, which is he enters that moment in that exact way and says there is a miracle, and I am He. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think that's maybe the core of what you're trying to introduce us to in the Shadow of Tyranny. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Because getting back to the Gospel of Luke, I think Luke, all the Gospels do this, but I think Luke, among all four, is the most direct about this,
Okay.
about how Jesus is trying to. So, this particular week that we're in, as we're recording this
Yeah.
conversation, is we're in the season of Lent, and the Lent in the Christian liturgical calendar is capturing the stories of Jesus' life between the Mount of Transfiguration and Jesus' entry into Jerusalem for his final week, which we call Holy Week or the Passion Week. And during in the Gospel of Luke, Luke takes 10 chapters to tell the story of Jesus' journey and all of the teaching that Jesus does during this travel narrative. It's predominantly parables, excuse me, and most of it is in direct conversation with the Pharisees. And so, to put some cultural context around it, I think Jesus loved the Pharisees. And the Pharisees were a group of Jewish leaders who, so I know we can't actually do this, but I try to play the mental game of what it must have been like to be a first century Palestinian Jew, right?
Mm-hmm.
So here you are, you're a people who have had hundreds of years of oppression, like multiple empires that have occupied your land, and you've spent centuries asking one big theological question: where is God?
Yeah.
Why, if we're the chosen ones, if God promised our father Abraham that we would become a great nation and through us all nations would be blessed, in Jesus' day the question was, why are the Romans on every street corner? Like, and why is the king Herod, who is on the throne, just in the pocket of Rome and extorting our own people? So you have Herod, who's getting wealthy in the extortion of his own people. He's not even a rightful heir to the throne of David. So every different faction of Jews are asking the question, where is God, and what are we supposed to do? And I think, you can go through and look, the Sadducees had an answer, the Herodians had an answer, the Essenes had an answer, right? The Zealots, their answer was just kill them all, revolt.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the Pharisees' answer was, we just have to follow the law better. Like, God gave us the law of Moses, and Deuteronomy says if we follow the law, we will be blessed, and if we don't follow the law, we'll be cursed. And so the Pharisees looked at their country and said, there's so much lawlessness, there are so many people breaking the law, that our job as leaders is to teach the law properly, to expose and expel the sinners. And if we can either get people to follow the law or get the lawbreakers out, then maybe God would bless us and we'd be free of the Romans, right? So again, like, that's a valid point. That's a legitimate understanding of what it meant to be a Jewish leader in that day.
Yeah.
And so one of the reasons I think Jesus is particularly in conversation with the Pharisees is because he loves them and he loves their passion for God.
Yeah.
But what he's trying to expose to them is that they're missing the point. And because what they were saying is that it's all about the boundaries that define us against you. Like circumcision, dietary practices, all of these things that mark us as Jewish, those things in and of themselves are good, right? But when they focused on the boundary and they said the criteria for God's blessing is for you to be inside the boundaries, and if you're outside the boundaries, which they would call sinner, then you are outside of the promise of God. And so Jesus, so this week we're looking at the parable of the lost things, right? And so in the beginning of chapter 15, Luke tells us that the Pharisees looked at Jesus and said, he welcomes and eats with sinners. And they're like, how can he be a good man? And Jesus is like, I think what Jesus is doing is challenging their definition of what is a sinner. And he's just challenging the boundaries.
Yeah.
And so I always, here's another theoretical model I bring in, and I'm not unique in this, but Hebert's theories, set theory, where there's a difference between a bounded set and a centered set, right? I'm sure you've heard that many times, but a bounded set is where you focus in on the boundaries that define a group and everything inside the boundaries are identical. But a centered set is a diversity of things can become a set when they're unified on the thing that centers them. And I think that's what Jesus was inviting the Jews to, is because Jesus is trying to expand the scope of the promise of God outside of these rigid boundaries that the Pharisees were trying to protect to the whole world. Like the people that you call sinner, God doesn't see them as a sinner. God sees them as a beloved child. And all are welcome. And what centers us is the cross of Christ and the love of God, right? and seeking towards peace and reconciliation. I don't know that. So that's what I think Luke's trying to do, and also
Mm-hmm.
Luke is challenging power, and
Yeah.
what because he continually talks about he's the king, but he's born in a stable. He, in contrast to Matthew's version of the story, Matthew has the wealthy people showing up and giving this baby Jesus all these kingly things, but in Luke's Jesus, he's born in a stable. Common shepherds visit him, and the Holy Spirit is the one who guides him. And so you have this man of the people who is seeking, who touches the leper, who hangs out with the sinners and the outcasts, and just turns power structures upside down and opens up. Another interesting thing about Luke is, like, when you compare the genealogy of Matthew to the genealogy of Luke, Matthew traces Jesus back to Abraham to show that he's a good Jewish man. But Luke traces Jesus to Abraham, but then also back to Adam, because Luke is trying to show us that the promise of God is for everybody, the whole world. Now I'm just preaching. Sorry. So
No, you're good. You're good. Keep it going. Yeah, I think that idea of, like, we're all connected through a common thread, and that thread being the person of Jesus, like, that's a really powerful idea that distinguishes, like, being connected because we're in the same box.
right.
It's like a network effect versus I don't know. It just seems like there's something about that's, I think, worth exploring even further.
So what's cool when you said network, it captured my imagination, and I think of a spider web.
Uh-huh.
And the cool thing about a spider web is it has a center point, but it also anchors on multiple points. And
Mm.
so, like this, so another exposure of my bias. I am a Trinitarian theologian,
Yeah.
uh, and I'm deeply rooted in this idea that the relationality of God. That's a really nerdy word, but the relationality of God is the ground of all being, right? So, like,
Yeah.
all of creation is interdependent and interconnected. And so
Yes.
when I think about a spider web, for the Christian imagination, the center point is the cross of Christ. Not the doctrine of the church, but the actual cross of Christ, that God would become flesh and empty God's self and be crucified, right? And rise from the dead. But the anchor points of the outside of the web are the actual God in reality, right? Because all
Mm-hmm.
things are in God. And so
Yeah.
it's not this box that is Jesus, but it is anchored in the ultimate reality of God in God's self, which is all things connected, but central on the focus of
Mm-hmm.
the theology of the cross. So I don't know. It's just an interesting
Yeah.
visual
Well, and I guess,
image.
yeah, and what I would argue then, to kind of take that even further, is if the cross is the center of God's being, it's really an external manifestation of what's internal to who God is, right? So the cross, what's driving God to go to the cross, is a part of who He is. The cross is sort of like an exclamation point on that. Does that make sense? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And that gets into, like, incarnation theology, right? Where
Yeah.
where some would say, and I think it's good, like, the first incarnation is the universe itself, right? Where God
Yeah.
speaks all things into being. And so we
Mm.
have this physicality of God in the physical universe, and in matter and energy. And the point of the universe is life and flourishing and mutual flourishing. And so the particular person of Jesus is an incarnation of God for humanity, for the
Mm-hmm.
human species,
Yeah.
to see
Yeah.
how God, and to your point, the centrality of God is the emptying of God's self for the good of the whole,
Yeah.
right? And so even in just the act of incarnation and becoming human is an emptying of God's self into the person of Jesus of Nazareth. And then that person emptying himself into death on the cross is just this layers of the self-giving love of God is the way of life.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the resurrection is the yes to,
Yeah.
I think there's life beyond the exclamation point, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
the point of it isn't death. The point is life. And
Yeah.
so we come into resurrection life where we get to start
Yeah.
over.
And I guess we all have the other thing that comes to mind is we all have the opportunity to participate in that.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess since you're Lutheran, I'll use Luther. It seems like him nailing to the door, his papers there was like a cross moment. Like, hey, the church, you are trying to exclude people, and I'm here to say that they're included. And that seems like a cross moment, like a participation in the cross. So what would you say to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Luther never wanted to start a new church. Jesus didn't want to start a new religion. Luther didn't want to start a new church. What Luther was doing was naming the corruption that had worked its way into the church through the distortion of power, and he just called it out. He's like, "You're," and I think that's what Jesus is doing with the Pharisees in this moment, right?
Yeah.
He's calling out the exclusionary domination system. Because what's really interesting, going back to Luke 15, I've been studying this week, so that's why it's fresh in my mind,
Yeah.
is that we look at the parable of the lost things, lost sheep, lost coin, the prodigal son, and it's easy to take those out and just preach a fun sermon about lost things. But what we often forget is that the very next set of parables that are in the same breath is Jesus talking about the corrupting power of money and how the Pharisees loved money. The next parable is the parable of the rich man and the poor man named Lazarus, who end up in Hades, and just that whole reversal. And he's warning the Pharisees. It's like, if you don't wake up to this inversion that you've placed over this gift of being a leader, it's going to blow up in your face, and you're hurting a lot of people. And this is not the way of God in the world. So please stop. And so I think that was the heart. I mean, Luther was he could be a jerk, that's for sure. But when he nailed those 95 Theses, that's what he was doing. He's calling them out and saying, stop abusing your power. And I say yes
Yeah.
to your question.
Yeah. Well, I think that directly ties into this idea of the gospel in the shadow of the empire, the shadow of tyranny. And so he's take that and then repurpose it for us as a directive for how to navigate the current societal context. What's the application for us here?
Well, I wish I had the answer to that, right? So yeah, this is a tricky one, because the actual answer is love your neighbor as yourself, right? That's always the right answer.
Yeah.
The question is, how do you love your neighbor that's trying to kill you? And this is why Bonhoeffer has surfaced quite a lot lately.
Yeah.
As Bonhoeffer and
who was in the Lutheran tradition, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and so Bonhoeffer was a young theologian, like an amazing theologian. The guy had 2 PhDs before he was 25 years old, and
Yeah.
he's writing during the rise of Hitler in Germany. In case any of your listeners don't know who Bonhoeffer is, and it's interesting because he was trained theologically under a particular German way of understanding theology, and that German theology actually gave fuel to Hitler. this exceptionalism and how
Mm-hmm.
the Aryan nation was very attractive to the German theologians. And it wasn't until Bonhoeffer came to the United States and hung out with the Black Church in New York,
Mm-hmm.
Abyssinian Baptist Church, I think was the name of the church, and understood what it means to be a follower of Jesus when you are truly an oppressed people.
Mm-hmm.
And he saw the crucified God in reality. And it just opened up his world and his imagination. So he could no longer be silent. He could no longer be complicit to this oppressive regime that was rising. So he was willing
Mm-hmm.
to go back to Germany and lead the underground church to the point of being willing to die. And all throughout the Gospel of Luke, Jesus continually tells his disciples, if you follow me, you have to take up your cross. And that wasn't metaphorical. Like, he knew that he would be crucified, and he knew that anyone who followed him would also be crucified,
Yeah.
or eliminated by the empire in one way or another. And so whenever you speak the countercultural gospel of Jesus, that is love for all people, domination systems can't tolerate that.
Mm-hmm.
And they will always seek to silence you.
Yep.
And sometimes silencing you is canceling you on social media. Sometimes it is freezing you out of an organization. And then in its radical extreme, it's actual like execution.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's interesting because one of the things I'm working on a book that I'm writing now called From the Garden to the Cross. I've been working on it for about 4 years, and how it relates to that is, in many ways, I feel like the church has just fallen all over itself. It's kind of succumbing to many of the theological dynamics you described there, where like, okay, that maybe this like end times theology, in modern American Christianity just seems like, okay, I think we got that one pretty wrong, and it really messed us up. And so I was really inspired. One of the things that really kind of disillusioned me with the current church in its modern manifestation in America, in many ways, is the contrast to the early church in ancient Rome. And I'm thinking, wow, look at these Christians, like they like, I was reading one book where like they had such faith that they could literally be willing to do these things, step out, love their neighbor, be vulnerable to get the plague and die. And they had such faith that they knew their neighbor would take care of their kids if that happened.
Mm.
Right. So they had such a level of faith and a level of selflessness that just kind of puts us to shame. And then we become more and more selfish. It created this very stark contrast. And that's one of the origins of my book, is kind of wrestling through that myself. And I think, we're the boiling frogs in a way, it seems like.
Yeah, I think you froze up there for a second.
No, I just stopped.
Oh, the
Yeah,
boiling frog. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. When you use that metaphor of the boiling frog, it activates a lot of old messages from when I was a kid.
Oh,
Very
yeah.
fundamentalist background.
Okay. What was that?
Because I was raised on a theological tradition that was very, very, very skeptical of American society and secularism, and
Mm-hmm.
very afraid of what they would call liberalism or Protestant liberal theology. And so the fundamentalists who were saying, who were actually behaving like Pharisees, like, here are the boundaries, like, here are the 12
Mm-hmm.
fundamentals, here are the marks of what it means to be a true disciple of Jesus. And they're very clearly delineated. And if you step outside of that and you like open yourself up to psychology, or the possibility that Darwinian understanding of evolution could be a way God created the universe, like, you're selling out into the
Mm-hmm.
secular world, and or listening to secular music, all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like, every little bit that you give in to that side is like the slow boiling of the frog. And
Yeah.
so I was raised in a childhood culture that created a great amount of fear of the outside world. And so that's just what was activated for
Yeah.
me. And so
Yeah.
that's why I call myself, I'm among many who grew up in that culture and consider myself a post-evangelical. I'm not an anti-evangelical. I'm so grateful for so much of how I was raised,
Yeah.
and yet so much of it became really problematic, like a
Hmm.
very narrow view of atonement, a very narrow understanding of the gospel, and a narrow understanding of the church. That as soon as you start challenging the boundaries, you become dangerous,
Yeah.
and that's when you kind of get exited out of that world.
Yeah. And I think to kind of take what you're describing and kind of flip it, I think what happened is they were so afraid of the secularization, but they had superficial descriptions that they were able to preserve the superficial descriptions, and without realizing it, they became secular in what actually mattered. And so instead of loving your neighbor as yourself, they they essentially got rid of that in practice, but they kept sort of some of those rules. So it looked like they were Christian, or they looks like they are Christian when they're actually secular. They just have Christian language or a Christian veneer. Would you agree with that or disagree?
Yeah, I think so. I like the way you put it. I'll have to think about how they became secular. I would agree that they lost the understanding of what it means to love your neighbor. Um, I would, yeah. So for me, the way I've always framed it and tried to understand it is, um, like that substance dualism is what was part of the problem,
Mm.
because of that secular sacred divide, and also the spiritual physical divide. All that mattered was your spiritual relationship with God, that ultimately is just about the afterlife. So that it became easy to like dismiss the physical world, dismiss
Mm-hmm.
this current age as the world, like everything about this universe is the world. And so it's okay if it all goes to hell, right? Because we're just going to go to heaven. If you
Mm-hmm.
believe the right things, you're going to go to heaven. You're going to escape all of the destruction, And you mentioned end time stuff earlier. So all of that. So I guess yeah, it is an interesting inversion, because when you separate out love of God from love of neighbor, and you see them as two separate things, and loving God is all you do, but loving God is up here apart from the physical
Mm-hmm.
world, then you do actually become secular in the sense that you're not connected to the actual reality that we live in. So yeah, that's
Yeah.
interesting. I've never heard it framed exactly that way, but I like it.
Yeah. I think it really ties into the tribalism, I think, as well. My tribe matters and yours doesn't. I'm going to
Right.
dehumanize your tribe and I'm going to
Yep. Yep.
defend my tribe. And what Jesus is saying is like, and like you said earlier, like I love all of you and all of our lives matter. And so it kind of goes back to your point of like, how do you love your neighbor when they're trying to kill you? Well, Jesus says to die for them, like,
Yeah. And
so
forgive them.
something's, and forgive them.
Yeah.
Like,
Like
something's wrong
nobody
here.
wants.
Like we're,
Yeah. Nobody wants to
yeah.
do that.
And I don't want to do that,
I
but
don't. You know.
there's something there that I have to wrestle with. And I guess, do I want to wrestle with it? I think is a big question. Like, do I want to actually reconcile that, or do I want to sort of stick, kind of
Yeah.
not even consider it? That's
So yeah. So what did Jesus mean when he said, "If you want to gain your life, you must lose it"?
mm-hmm.
Was that like? Was he talking about if you want to go to heaven when you die, you just die? I, I maybe. I don't think so though. I think he's talking about what we're talking about is the idea of the only way to actually win is to lose the game
choosing
that's
to
being
lose.
played, because it's the game that's being played of power, zero
Mm-hmm.
sum. That's the problem. And so when you lose the game, now throw systems theories in, right? That's when you throw a wrench in the system.
Yeah.
Like the game is the bully wants you to fight back. But if you don't fight back to the bully, now what does the bully do? Like that throws a wrench in the system.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand that it's way more complex. It's easy
Yeah.
for me to sit here in my nice little comfortable house and my suburban world and talk about all these things in theory. But just recently, one of our students, he's from a country that I won't name because I don't want to identify my student, but a
Yeah.
country that is experiencing severe persecution. And this student was just saying, just helped me understand the complexity of nonviolent resistance
Mm-hmm.
and how when your children are being murdered in the streets, how difficult it is to follow that. So I just want to name, like, it's not an easy conversation. There's no like clear cut
Yeah.
right answer to, but I do think it ultimately comes back to wrestling with the question, what does it mean to love my neighbor? One of my professors talked about love is like a stem cell,
Mm-hmm.
which I love that metaphor because he said, and he was what did he call it? And his ethical persuasion was responsibilist. He was a responsibilist in his ethics, where it's different than situational ethics, but it's similar, right? So what he would say is the ethical response to any situation is the answer to the question, what does love look like in this context? And so love is like a stem cell where when you put a stem cell into a context, the stem cell becomes the context that it needs in order to help it.
Mm-hmm.
And so like loving my neighbor actually looks different
Mm-hmm.
depending on the context that I'm in.
Yeah.
And sometimes you can take the exact same action, and in one context it's loving my
Mm-hmm.
neighbor, and in another context it's actually hurting my neighbor. And that's where it's really complicated. And that's where, like, from a spiritual formation perspective, that's where discernment is so necessary,
Yeah.
of discerning, like, okay, so what is God actually asking me to do in this moment?
Yeah. And that's that kind of personalization. I think is part of why the two ideologies that are anchored, they're anchored in some these variables that may be so dramatically different for somebody else that, like you said, you could interact with that same person in the same way you would people in your own tribe, but it actually is harmful, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so do we care enough to know that, to want to seek that, so that when we interact with those people, we're not hurting them when we don't even know that we're doing that. And I think that's one of the things, just from my own experience too, is like you have to meet different people at different places in different ways. And sometimes that means we might have to grow into something that looks a lot different than what we're used to or how we normally react or handle situations. But this other type of thing, we have to be a different type of person, and that requires change and adaptability.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that point of like, what does love require of me is kind of what Andy Stanley says in his book, Irresistible, which is a similar sentiment. And, I might, taking the time, like I've interacted with someone in this way and it kind of unraveled in a way. Okay, how did I drop the ball? What did the love require of me, and where did I succeed? Where did I fail? And continuing like to refine myself and let God work that out, so that the next time, I'm a little bit better and I'm, getting a little bit, transforming. But it's this dialectic, like you said earlier, but it's in relationship with God. It's in
Yeah.
relationship with people.
Yep.
It's not in isolation. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the key to all of this is the ability to listen, the
Mm,
ability to listen to the other.
okay.
Because I can't know what is required of love in a context unless I really understand the context. And I
Yeah.
can't
Mm-hmm.
understand a context unless I take the time to listen and
Yeah.
learn and know, who is this person? What does this person, what, uh, to go way back to the idea of paradigm shift,
Mm-hmm.
just taking the time to to learn a person's context will help you change your paradigm, your understanding of that person, and see that what what you perceive through your paradigm, their behavior being maybe inappropriate or wrong behavior. When you take the time to understand their paradigm, you can see why they're doing what they're doing. Now, it might still
Yeah.
be inappropriate behavior, it might still be destructive behavior, but you have a better understanding of why they're doing it. So it helps you love them better.
Yeah. Yeah, I think of, just I would call it, label that as cognitive empathy, which is essentially at least just going through that exercise to understand how they're seeing it, why they're seeing it. And it's important as a Christian to like be able to know how to love them. But it does take effort and work, and you end up having to
Yeah.
kind of do that with somebody that might be um, like you might have to be the one to go first in a sense.
Yeah. What's
Or
really interesting when we talk about empathy, what's really interesting is I've just recently come across a growing movement of people who are calling out the sin of empathy. And I'm really curious about that. Like, I want to know more about why some
yeah,
Christians are saying that empathy is actually the problem. Like, huh?
yeah, I think
I,
yeah.
I need
Well,
to
here's what
understand that more.
yeah. If I've seen that as well, and if I were to, you kind of have to go into each individual because to see where the specifics are. But if I were to be the most generous in that, I think what they're trying to say is that our our generosity and grace and empathy can be used to manipulate us. And so, if someone's trying to control or manipulate you, then they can do things to manipulate you. I think it would be healthier if they just kind of said that, because then it turns into this other thing with that doesn't seem accurate. But I don't, that's just based on what I've seen so far. That would be my understanding. But so I think the actual issue is a little bit different, and then I think the actual solution is a little bit different. And it feels to me like they're moving the language a little bit to make it more controversial.
Yeah,
So
that's what it seems like,
yeah,
but I don't know enough about it. Anyway, I would agree. Empathy is important. The ability to listen to others. You can't love somebody if you don't actually know who they are. But but again, going back to the interdependence, the relationality of God and of reality itself. And so when going back to that video of the two,
yeah,
the red and the blue towers, until they're willing to open up the gate, listen to the other side, have the conversation, as tense as the conversation might be, that relationship that's developed. Have you seen the movie or heard of the movie called Best of Enemies?
yeah. Well, I have a little bit of a funny story. I have not seen the movie, but I know about the story. Because funny enough, so I've done a little bit of movie extra work, and I ended up having when they made the movie, they contacted me to be a stand-in for one of the actors, but I couldn't do
Oh
it because it
wow!
was like a 3-month commitment. But it was just a
Oh
funny, interesting. But I love the story because I've also there's a lot of stories like that I followed, and I actually had the chance to interview Daryl Davis. I don't know if you know him, but he's a black man, and he goes to KKK events to love and serve KKK members to try and liberate them from the movement. And he's saved like around 100 people, I think. So it's a very similar story. But anyway,
yeah,
tell us a little bit
yeah.
about it, the premise, so people that aren't familiar.
Oh yeah. So the movie, it's based on a true story. In the 1970s, there was in the South. I can't remember the name of the town, but it's in the South, which was historically, of course, segregated. And there was the black school burned down or had a fire and so the school was uninhabitable. And so the town had to come up with, so what do we do with, the black kids in school? Where do they go? And like, well, the answer is integration. And and the white population, the KKK was like, that's not going to happen. And so the mayor was caught in the middle of this. And so the mayor went to the north and brought in a person to do I always forget the name of the process that he did. There's a specific process of community building where you take 2 weeks and you bring the factions of people. You basically call a ceasefire, a truce between the warring factions in the community, and you bring them together and you partner them up, and you start listening to each other's stories.
Mm.
And the leader of this took a black woman who was the leader of the community organization movement and the president of the KKK and made them co-chairs of the committee.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a movie about their relationship. And what happens is that the man, the KKK leader, this is back in the 70s, remember, his son had Down syndrome. And in that moment of our history, Down syndrome children were often institutionalized. And so his son was in an institution, but he didn't want to talk about it. And he felt a lot of shame around it, but he deeply loved his son. And so this woman took the time to get to know this guy and actually went and helped his son. And through her act of generosity and love, this man in the end actually turned on the Klan and didn't vote for segregation and voted for integration, and ended up becoming like excommunicated from the Klan. And it's just a really, really powerful movie.
Yeah.
And then they ended up touring around the country talking about reconciliation, racial reconciliation. It's a really, really cool story.
Yeah. And it's exactly what we're talking about is how do you love your neighbor who's trying to kill you? Here's an example of it. Here's a little miracle of it. And if they can do it, like I hear that, I see that, and I go, man, if they can do that, I can at least move in that direction.
That's right. That's right.
There should be at least a step I can take.
Yeah.
It's inspiring for me, I think.
It's inspiring. And to flip it, like in this current moment, friends who are being deported and friends whose children are trans or LGBTQ who are feeling like physically threatened because legislation is moving against them. What's your response to that? Like, I don't want to just like not respond to that and be like, well, let's just have I don't know. I know the response isn't violence. I know that's not the response. Yeah. But
so a couple things. The tension. You mentioned the tension. This is an interesting thing because I was talking to a friend in regards to the election, and I am, I've been a Christian all my life, and I've been in the Republican world for most of it, and essentially, I grew up as a Republican, but I'm been vocal about my opposition to Trump, specifically this last election. And so it was interesting because, in 2020, I was already kind of there. And so when Biden won, I felt the tension I had felt before kind of relieve. But my friend was the opposite. For him, like a Democrat being in the lead, the tension now, it created the tension for him. And so that kind of drove certain behaviors to we feel the tension. And so we go in different places sort of to make ourselves feel safe. Right. And now we've switched places again. Right. So now for him, the tension is resolved. And now I feel the tension, and so I feel like we're handing off tension to each other. And it seems like we're getting to a place now where like the tension is just actually going to be constant. There isn't going to be a relief so much because now when the other side's in power, then the tension's just going to be, it's going to sort of pull us in like a magnetic force, it seems like. Yeah. So I think that tension is a chance for us I think if we try and destroy the tension, I think then that becomes dangerous. But I think if we let it transform us, that's an opportunity. Yeah. That's one thing that comes to mind. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things I've been telling my students is One of the definitions of anxiety is when you focus your attention on the things you can't control.
Hmm.
And so much of what's happening is actually outside of our ability to control it. And so, first of all, just take a few deep breaths, and then start focusing in on your sphere of influence. And I'm just borrowing from Stephen Covey, like
Yeah.
focus on your sphere of influence, make the changes that you can actually make, and then maybe your sphere of influence will expand. So that being said, as Christian public leaders, um, I think one of the things that this affords us an opportunity to model generative conversation, and that's why I don't think pastors should get in the pulpit and like bash one party and promote another party. I don't think it should be about partisanship in the church. I think it should be about um, demonstrating the ability to have civic discourse that doesn't want to kill the other side.
Yeah.
But being like we as a campus, we read a really great book by Maria Guzman called "I Never Thought of It That Way Before." That's a really great book talking about how to, and it comes from the Higher Angels. Is that what it's called? Braver Angels
Mm.
group
Oh, okay. Yeah.
of how to create spaces for these factions to come together and learn how to listen to one another without allowing the emotional response to escalate, but to just do the deep listening. And so, like, maybe what we can do is first of all model a generative listening and an openness, like from leadership, and and if we can model that in our local contexts, I think the actual answer politically is if our legislative bodies would learn how to be civil to one another, then we
Yeah.
can model, because law is actually made in the Congress, and
Hmm.
if the partisanship could break down at that actual representative level, where representatives can if they could just start thinking about the whole instead of protecting their party, then there might be hope. But
Yeah. Yeah. I think modeling is a really important facet for sure. When you look at just how the American Civil War unfolded, what you saw was this escalation. I didn't know this, but apparently there were like people that were like having fistfights in Congress. They were, someone brought a gun, and I don't know if he shot it at someone, but it was like things escalated, like you're describing, even more than what we've seen now. And we've seen like little bits and pieces of some of that, but those are like kind of signals, like, hey, we're moving in the wrong direction, and who's willing to step into that and kind of be the bridges, bear the crosses,
yeah,
and it's hard, and it's only going to get harder.
I think so. Yeah,
Yeah.
I wish I had the magic pill to take to make it all better.
Yeah.
But contextually, I think each leader. I speak as a Christian public leader to Christian public leaders, and I think our call in this moment is to read the room, read the context, and know your
Yeah.
people, know the particular anxieties that your particular group of people are having, and just be attentive to them and help. Like for me, I know it sounds really simplistic, but what's really important for me is to go back and study the Gospels, like really,
Hmm.
really well. That's why bringing it back to the Gospel of Luke in the shadow of tyranny, right? Is is by spending time just really studying the life of Jesus. That's where it has to start, because I think it's very easy to get caught up in political rhetoric that is Christian in veneer, but isn't necessarily anchored in the actual Jesus narrative, right? And so if we can come back to who Jesus was and how he dealt with these questions in his context, then we can come back to, and it's a both and, right? I mean, because he didn't live in the United States in the 21st century, but just being anchored in that is a really important practice.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think it's great. Any other final words of wisdom as we wrap up here?
Well, that's assuming we've spoken any words of wisdom at this point. But no, I appreciate the opportunity to chat, and I'm just amazed that one little post out there sparked this conversation on your podcast. So I'm just grateful for the opportunity. I'm just trying to be a disciple of Jesus and trying to lead other people to the cross. So
Yeah. So tell us about how people can, like, where are you at online? How can they
oh
find you? How can they explore your work?
yeah, my self-promotion moment.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Tell us all the
So
URLs and stuff.
yeah. So my my screen name or my ministry is called, I call myself the Art Pastor. So if you go to artpastor.com, that will take you to the main landing page for everything. It's also, that's actually a fake URL because it's really two websites. I have stevethomason.com and then I have cartoonistbible.com. And those are the places that you can find all my work, where I like I said, I do the weekly lectionary stuff, that you can subscribe to that. You can subscribe to my blog. You can go to the YouTube channel. And I also have an online network called Art Pastors Network. Like if you want to join,
Okay.
and I do like a weekly text study,
Yeah.
exploring spirituality and scripture through visual art and creativity.
Okay.
That's my mission statement.
And who's the ideal target for group of people for that platform?
Yeah. Well, ideally, people who are interested in spirituality and scripture at multiple levels. I mean, the Venn diagram is people who love to geek out over Christian spirituality, who love studying scripture, and who have some form of artistic flair. Now, I'm a
Mm,
visual artist, but it can be any kind of art. And so the fusion of spirituality, scripture, and art,
yeah.
those are the people that would find this to be a fun place to be.
Okay.
And I also cater to Christian public leaders like pastors and
Okay.
teachers who are looking to use visual resources in their communication.
Okay. Cool. All right. Well, we'll put a link in the notes, and anyone who's interested can explore that further. And we'll put a link to the other videos that we mentioned and the blog posts that we talked about. And yeah, well, thank you, Steve, so much for sharing your life and your story and your insights and everything else with us.
Well, thanks so much, Jason. It was an honor to be invited, and I enjoyed our conversation.